one of the arguments that people make for why trust in science really matters is that really about trust in the products of science, where, that drives adoption. And ultimately, that adoption drives the pace of change and innovation in society. And that's one of the reasons why trust is important.
Hello, Laws of Notion podcast listeners. I'm Kristan Uhlenbrock, and I'm excited to bring you our final episode in the Compass series, where we've been discussing topics related to our current state of affairs. In this episode, we discuss building trust with Dr. Cary Funk. Cary brings us deep insight to help us understand the current landscape of trust in science, as well as practical approaches to strengthening it. With over 2 decades of experience in public opinion research, Cary has significantly contributed to our understanding of public trust in science. Many people may know her from her time at the Pew Research Center, and currently she is a senior advisor to the Aspen Institute's Science and Society program. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Cary, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to jump right into our conversation today around the relationship between people, society, and science. And specifically, I want to talk to you about the role of trust, which you've done much work on over the years. What has your research shown about the role of public trust in science?
Sure. I think the first thing to remember is that when we're talking about trust in science, we're almost always talking about a mental model that's really built on trust between two people. And then we just extend that model to thinking about two kind of groups of people, kind of abstract groups of people, scientists and the public, both of which are very large, diverse groups. I have been thinking a lot about trust in science as we're in this moment. And one of the things I'm doing is kind of going back to our kind of influential thinkers about the definition of trust. And one of those influential thinkers is Russell Hardin, who really talks about trust as being fundamentally relational. It's rooted in relationships between people. And the idea that when you trust someone, you're making a judgment about what you can expect from them in the future, generally their behaviors. And the definition of trust is already multifaceted because your expectations for their behaviors is one part is about the idea that they can carry out what you're expecting them to do. So that's kind of their competence, their ability. And the other part is actually that they're carrying out that behavior in a way that goes beyond their own incentives for acting. And it actually is reflecting your concerns or best interests. So when you think about that and how we ask often about trust in scientists, they actually match up pretty well. That we're often saying, how much do you trust or have confidence in scientists to act in a way that's in the public's best interest, essentially? I think that makes sense to me. I want to address one thing that comes up again and again among my friends and respected colleagues in the science communication world. A lot of people spend time talking about our polls on trust in scientists, and they're trying to point out that trust is reasonably high among a majority of Americans. And that is true. It's true when you look at the data, a majority of Americans kind of tilt positive about scientists. What I tend to point out is that it's a tilt, not a strong positive. You have, if you just cut the world into 3 groups, roughly half of Americans who have this kind of soft positive orientation towards trusting scientists. And then the rest are divided between that strong positive and a negative. So we all agree about the data. The thing is, we're having this conversation around trust in scientists, not because of majority opinion. We're having the conversation because the size or the share of Americans who hold this more negative view, a more skeptical view of scientists, has grown over the last few years. So it's just another example of how discourse can be driven not just by majorities, but by people who feel strongly, and they might be in the numerical minority. So I think we need to pay attention to that. If anything, the science community writ large has been doing kind of too little for too long. And so that's where I'm standing now.
How does trust differ between individual scientists and scientific institutions?
A great question. We spent a lot of time talking about trust in scientists, like the people who are doing science, but we also should be talking about trust in the institutions that produce science. There are a number of people who make that their main area of focus. I'm just going to mention a couple, and who are thinking about our institutions and the way they demonstrate their trustworthiness as being an important piece. So I think about Ivan Oransky and the Retraction Watch, the Center for Open Science, led by Brian Nosek. Those are part of a broader effort, I think, to show that the research we do is following high standards and is transparent and open to others. There are lots of people like this in the UK and Europe who are also doing this, who are focused on what they call responsible research practices at institutions and how that can support trust in science by using these procedures and being transparent about doing that. You didn't ask this question, but I'm going to tell you this. One thing that I am thinking about that I have gotten wrong in the past couple of years is that I really was underestimating the degree to which our trust in scientists is intertwined with our trust in these institutions. And by that, I would include government institutions and higher ed, media to some degree. I think we're seeing that crystal clear now as everything is intertwined, but for a long time, we could measure it and separate it out, and we kind of thought about it differently. And I think that we're seeing now that we really need to realize how much they are intertwined. One of the pieces of why that makes sense is, for one thing, we know that a lot of our experiences with science is through the lens of government actors, government scientists who are talking to us about science. A lot of it's through the lens of media, traditional media, telling us about science and engaging with science that way. And then obviously from the coronavirus pandemic, scientists were front and center in so many ways that they hadn't been before. But it was also very clear that these were government scientists, or at least it seemed as if they were government scientists that were driving policy. And of course, those policies ended up being very divisive. So you can see how the ideas of government overreach and follow the science kind of became intertwined during that period.
Let me have you actually unpack that a little bit more as far as whether it is public opinion and polling data, because it starts to get a little bit of perhaps blurry. And as you said, you need to kind of come in and look at where are these similarities, where is there some of that correlation.
I think we've been talking for a long time about how trust in institutions generally is at a low period and over the period that we've been tracking these kinds of things, and particularly trust in government and trust in the media is a widely shared skepticism, essentially. And sometimes people say, oh, but look, trust in scientists is relatively high compared to that. A lot of these things were happening over long periods of time, but the intertwining of our trust in scientists with trust in government and trust in higher ed is another element of this. All of this was exacerbated during the coronavirus pandemic. These were trends that have gotten wider over time. And so over long periods of time, yes, there was more bipartisan support across the board for scientists. And of course, it was over long periods of time that there was a decline in trust in government. I wanted to underscore the one piece around higher ed. Just as an example, Pew Research Center surveys had been showing political divisions around higher education and leaders of higher education since at least 2018. But in the science community, we hadn't really been talking about that, even though universities are, a core part of the science institutions that produce science research. So I think we had been missing that piece for a little too long.
In your work, you have looked at differences across demographic groups and how they perceive science. Give us some more of that insight you have into where trust in science is strongest, where is it most tenuous, and what are some factors that seem to be influencing these differences?
There's a lot we could talk about here, and I wanted to bring up some kind of ways to think about this that we don't talk about quite as often. One of that is to really think back to this idea of trust being rooted in relationships and then kind of rhetorically asking, well, why would we trust scientists or have a strong trust in scientists? Most of us are unlikely to know a scientist personally. We know from surveys that fewer than half of Americans can name a living scientist. And the very idea of science, it's so broad, it's so abstract, it can be hard to even know what a scientist does. So I want to talk about that as a way to think about how can we possibly improve trust in scientists. And one of the things the Aspen Institute, the Science and Society program, is doing right now is producing a feature-length documentary that features scientists across different fields. And it's going to immerse people into the lives of those scientists and showing both their personal side and their professional side, the nature of what they do in their research. And obviously, there are lots of people who are producing films that are really interesting, but we need more of these tools. We need podcasts, we need short form videos, we need full length films as tools to reach more people, right? To help personalize scientists. And I think, in terms of our what is trust conversation, to help show the care and concern that scientists have for other people, for using their science to help the rest of us. So obviously, those kinds of tools don't create a whole relationship, but they could open the door for more engagement with science. And one of the reasons I'm interested in this idea and this approach is when we were doing surveys for Pew Research Center, we were looking at the degree to which people think differently about different scientists of different specialties. We looked at 6 different kinds of scientists across the medical sciences, the environmental science, and food sciences. And what we found was across all 6 of those types of scientists, people who said they knew more about what that kind of scientist does tended to be more trusting and more positive about those scientists. So I see a lot of potential in this approach. We do need to be clear, we're not talking about understanding the facts and information of those kinds of science, but understanding a little more about what the value is of that kind of science for society.
So let's unpack and talk about this emphasis around relationships as being really fundamental to trust. What does it mean to build these meaningful relationships with communities? And what does it mean to build relationships with communities who may have been historically excluded from scientific conversations, scientific community?
The basics of what we're talking about is building relationships, and we're applying that to larger groups, to communities. And so the kind of the how-tos of it, in some ways, they're kind of common sense, but you need all the steps. First of all, show up, because when you're showing up in communities, you are demonstrating that you care. You show up repeatedly to demonstrate that you're reliable and can be counted on to be there for them. And then really beyond that, what's so important is to start by listening, to listen to other people's needs and perspectives first. It sounds a lot easier than it is to pull off. The more passionate you are about your science or what you think, the harder it is to listen first and to respond to what other people are worried about or thinking about. The other thing you just hear again and again is that as you're working with communities, perhaps ones that aren't exactly like you need to make sure you're demonstrating respect for others' opinions. Go back to the definition of trust, demonstrating concern for their interests and needs. All throughout that, you're acting with transparency and you're willing to address skepticism. One thing I talk about a lot is, we are living in a society that we think it's good to ask some questions. So the science community needs to expect skepticism and be prepared to address those kinds of questions without sounding defensive, right? With sounding open and understanding that it's okay to ask questions. All of that sounds really easy, but each community is different. And of course, you're going to customize how you do it for each of these communities. I want to talk 2 things about who we try to build trust with, and then come back to the idea of how do you bring in communities that perhaps haven't really been as engaged with science up to now. The one thing about who is, in general, if you're trying to build trust up, especially across large groups and populations, you start with the middle. You don't start with the people who are already on board or the people who are really hostile. Now, the good news is, as we talked about data, is there's a lot of people in the middle who are kind of open to the conversation. So that's generally what you do. When you're talking about local communities, the other thing you might think about is working with leaders or locally influential people in these communities. And the reason you do that is because number one, they're going to bring other people on board. So if you can get them on board, they kind of signal to others that you might be worth engaging with, and they can help bring more people in. I love this term that Carolyn Lawrence Dill, who's a dean of agricultural sciences at Colorado State, used recently. She called those local leaders our influencers of today. They're not the social media influencers, but they're the same thing just in real life. So that's another way to think about how do you work with communities. Working with, let's say, Latino communities, it's a good example where it's specific enough, but of course, no matter what group you're talking about, they're not monolithic. There's lots of variation. One thing to be aware of is they might be engaging with science, but not through a museum or not through a university. And so you need to be open to that and listening for that. One thing we heard again and again talking to people about how can we engage more with Latino communities is just the kind of basic advice of bring more people like us to the table. So if you can bring leaders that are Latino, that are of the community to the table, that's great. More is better. Obviously, language and cultural issues, you need to demonstrate your sensitivity and your inclusiveness in all of those interactions. Coming back to the idea of relationship means that it's not a one and done. You don't build relationships through a one-time experience. So you need to do all of that repeatedly and kind of put in the longer term commitment to increasing engagement with science that way.
You touched on how we're communicating a few times in there, and I do think that the words we use matter. And are we even speaking a common language and talking to one another in a way that is accessible and inclusive and brings people into a conversation? Any observations you've seen are really good examples of science communication that's been done particularly well and has been used to be able to bridge divides or to connect with folks who maybe had been a little skeptical of science?
I think language is a good point. If you studied science, you spent a long time learning all those special words, but they're not always accessible to other people. So you want to find ways to express your expertise that allow people to to hear you and not be confused by what you're saying. And there's a way in which it can be off-putting if you use too many of those jargony words. So I liked again, a point that Dr. Lisa of Grapevine Health likes to make, which is to speak in plain language. How do you talk in plain language to reach people so that you're making it easier for people to really engage with you and ask questions? Most of the examples that you see of where it's working tend to be in these smaller, more local contexts. And I'm hearing a lot of that of like, we need to start local. And I agree with that. Basically the idea of building relationships, it's easier if it's in a more local context where you could have more direct or more frequent interaction. And some of the examples that Jelana Sheets and I wrote about are really coming from public health. And why is that? Well, it's a field where there's a long tradition of building trust in communities in order to be part of helping those communities reach better health outcomes. One of the things that's daunting about this moment is the scale and scope of what we need. And so it can be overwhelming because we really do need everyone engaged. We need every person, every institution, every bridge building institution working together. We need all the new tools like films and podcasts to help us reach more people. And it's going to be a sustained effort to try to do that. I keep thinking about this and I keep coming back to, we're pretty good at showing the competence of scientists and science research institutions, but we're just not as good at showing the care and concern, the fact that we're doing this for their interests, that we're putting them first. Again, I sometimes think about it as the value back to society generally. I think it can be broader than that, but I feel like that's where we need the most work is helping people see the value. One of the challenges for the science community has been how dispersed we are. kind of the nature of scientists across all those different fields and disciplines. And there were lots of times where people kind of stuck to their own group. That hurts us from coming together. There's a long tradition in the news media of doing the same thing. People were bucketed into health and medical reporters or climate and energy reporters, and everyone else was science. Another lesson from the coronavirus pandemic is certainly that we realize now that all these areas of science are in one mental bucket for the general public. And so there is more kind of incentive and interest for us to work together, and hopefully that will help us bridge.
When trust has been damaged, how do you recover that trust once it's been lost?
Sometimes you need to start by apologizing and admitting there was wrongdoing. Whoever was most responsible is being held accountable. That's not always clear to people. You might need to talk about what you're doing to prevent these kinds of things. In thinking about the more egregious examples of what has gone wrong to really break trust, the principle that I hear first is we need to admit that there was something wrong and not just move forward. If you do that first, then you can open the door for building trust. There are less extreme examples, but maybe they're more impersonal. And you talked about bringing in communities that haven't been engaged in science to the same degree. I've heard a lot of people say the same things. It's like, first, we might need to admit that we were kept out of science institutions, and then there might be more room to rebuild trust. So it's the same principle, whether it's dispersed across many people over long periods of time versus maybe something more easily identified as egregious behavior.
Is science becoming more politicized? And if so, how do we address the politicization aspect where there are incentives? I'd be curious what the incentives would be to politicize it. And how would we address that?
You're going right for the hard questions. All right. We've been talking. When I started doing surveys, people didn't want to hear about politics. They didn't want to hear that there was ever any correlation between political kind of affiliation, ideology, and people's views. And honestly, it depended on the issue. Some things were more connected with political points of view, and other things weren't. What I saw in the data, and what I think many people saw in the data, is that over the course of the coronavirus pandemic, where we had about 6 weeks of kind of widespread consensus, and then about a couple of years, 3 years of division over almost every aspect of the handling of the pandemic, um, that exacerbated our political differences over science and scientists. Um, and what it did in particular related to all scientists being in one boat. In the old days, there was almost no political difference on people's views of medical doctors and medical researchers, medical scientists of different types. In the new days, they were front and center with public health experts, and now they're also seen in a different light depending on your own party. And some people hear this pattern and then they think everyone is exactly feeling that. And obviously not. Okay. These are broad patterns. There's lots of variation. There's a second thing going on that's really more describing what people who identify themselves from left or right, or from the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, tend to see and think about scientists. Of course, there are also people in power, and those elected leaders are politicized in different ways, and they're putting policies into place. One thing I'm thinking about for the science community is that you may or may not agree with what's going on between administrations, but uh, let's not make everyone who's a Republican an enemy of science. Let's start embracing and being more inclusive. We have some differences of opinion, but we also have some common ground, and we can make inroads in terms of building that relationship back.
In this moment in time, where are you finding hope and things to look forward to?
I think there is a lot of opportunity for us to have an open and deeper conversation around the place of science in society. And essentially, that's what's happening with policies. They're asking us to rethink almost everything that we took as assumptions. And so that means there's an opportunity for a deeper discourse around what do we want as a society and where do we go from here. What we have done politically, where we're just dividing into camps, and then we're going to have one set of policies and then play a tennis match and go a different way with the ping pong back and forth. That's not going to get us very far as a country. But as a country, how do we move forward if we're constantly changing back and forth? We need more of this open discourse to kind of find a way forward that isn't so dramatically shifting every so many years.
Cary, thank you so much for being here with me today. Where can people follow your work?
You can follow our work at the Aspen Institute Science and Society program. You can see many of my past writings and reports also on the web at pewresearchcenter.org.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about the Institute and this series, visit us at institute.dmns.org and be sure to sign up for our mailing list. Thanks and see you soon.